to Gwinnett County Public Library. My name is Amy Perry, and I'm an adult services specialist with the library. Thank you for joining our program with author Meg Zucker. Meg Zucker is the founder and president of Don't Hide It, Flaunt It, a nonprofit with the mission of advancing understanding and mutual respect for people with differences. A graduate of the University of Wisconsin-Madison and New York University School of Law, she is also the U.S. head of anti-money laundering and financial crime at the Royal Bank of Canada. Meg is also the author of Born Extraordinary, Empowering Children with Differences and Disabilities. Please welcome Meg Zucker.
So thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. We're very fortunate to have you, and I had a great opportunity to read your book. And as a mother of a child with cerebral palsy, this book really was a great guidebook, even as he is aged. I think I commented with you earlier how important this book, not only now, but I think for those mothers and parents who are just starting this journey, to know that information and to have it as a great guide. Can you tell us a little bit more about the background of how you came to write Born Extraordinary?
Yeah, so I mean, it's always hard in a webinar, but I was born with a genetic condition called ectrodactyly. Sounds more like a dinosaur type, as I like to joke. And I also like to joke, the older I get, the more I sort of match my label. But I came to write Born Extraordinary after having two of our three children share my condition. And when that happened, it was really one of those interesting moments of my life where my parents had raised me. I was the first, not the last, but the first to be born with my genetic condition. And not my brothers, no one, relatives or anything. But I wish my parents had written a guidebook for me, to help me sort of empower our own children. So I have one finger on each hand, shortened forearms, one toe on each foot. And the boys have a sort of combination of all of it. And so what I wanted to do is share my own sort of pieces of advice, certainly my mistakes. It's actually funny and maybe not so funny that there are the things that my parents did, had they written it down in the guidebook, that I didn't even do, that I should have done. So I think that it gets complicated, and all of us that are sort of managing the experience of raising children with differences or disabilities, we can all understand and appreciate that, we're just trying to do our best. And I wanted to write this book not only to share my story, but there are countless, I say countless, but I think there's at least stories from 30 other parents of children with differences and disabilities. So it really becomes not just our story, but a story that is much more powerful, having, a community of people contribute.
Right. And I think reading that book, especially with all your other examples of parents and their perspective of it. So of course, there's not one size fits all for what a disability or a difference is. So I think having the variety of their perspectives really make it, you can kind of pick and choose what relates to you and your life or your family's life. So I'm very appreciative of having that added into the book, as well as your humorous and real life experiences as well.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you picked up on that, actually, Amy, because we purposely wrote, you can pick and choose what's right for your family, like, because this is a broader book. This isn't a book that's your child has XYZ and therefore this is the book for you. And so once people understand and appreciate that, there are going to be certainly aspects of it that are universal, and there's going to be things that are more specific to a parent of a child with a physical difference or otherwise. But once people understand and appreciate that, then I think the book lends itself in the right way for each family, certainly based on the feedback, which I'm so super grateful for.
Right. And oftentimes we use those words kind of bounce around those words, disabilities or differences in your mind. And when you were writing this book, how do you define those?
Well, it was interesting because and I'm so glad you're asking the question. Originally, the book was called Born Different, helping your children claim their power. And my publisher at Tarcher Pergy, which is part of Penguin Random House, they were really saying, well, wait, Meg, what about disability? That should be in the title too. And I'm like, wow, that's really important. You're right. I'm certainly not trying to exclude anyone. And it sort of was this reckoning for me that I even called out in the book itself. And I thought, like, why difference? Why do I use that term versus disability? And so here's the point. I started to realize a few things. Number one, my parents raised me, and we've raised our children certainly to probably what it appears like defy the odds, and just sort of go for it. And so I had thought the word disabled, the label growing up was a negative. And quite frankly, I was getting ready for, I'm a lawyer, as well, and getting ready for work. And then I was like, why is that a negative? Because there's certainly people that fly the flag of disability pride, and that's an amazing thing. So what's wrong with me? And then I was getting ready for work and actually watching the news, and the traffic reporter was like, okay, everybody, your morning's ruined. You're not going to make that meeting. There's a disabled vehicle on the road and it's going to screw up your day. And then all of a sudden I'm like, wow, this term does have a negative connotation. No wonder I used to feel that way. And by the way, the people that are working towards moving the needle on that and thinking about, the embracement of that label, more power to any of us that do something like that, for sure. But here's the thing. I started thinking about the fact that, from not a perspective even of my own personal physical condition, but just as a parent of children that share it, you could have one parent saying, this is my daughter who's disabled. The next parent, same condition. This is my son who's differently abled. And the third, this is my daughter who's different. Same condition. And it made me realize something really important, which is we all need to just decide to, what's right for our own family and give one another the grace and respect to choose. We as parents might choose something and our own child might decide there's a different label that they feel comfortable with. That same child or even yourselves could end up evolving and saying, I'm different today and I'm disabled tomorrow, whatever the case may be. And so here's the point. Most of all, I wanted us to move on from the label in the book, because I think it really is just, consider the word different as the generic term of people that just feel or are treated as atypical from the norm. And once that sort of unites us, now let's do the digging, as I wrote in the book.
So do you like, is there a label that labels often just in itself is a negative terminology, but is there a label that you prefer for you and your family, or is it just kind of how in communication that you feel most comfortable?
I think what's most important for me is that I no longer resent anybody else's label. I've really evolved and embraced who I am, and cherish the fact that our children feel the same way. So I think it really doesn't, and I used to think it mattered, like, don't call me disabled. Like, how could, and in fact, I wrote an article in a publication, and it was kind of early on, and I was probably a little bit not as secure in my literary space, where I should have asserted myself, because they came up with the title, I did not. And it was called why I hate the word disabled. I'm like, what? So I hated that. But I think it was picked up based on that sort of story I told you about the traffic reporter. But I don't think in the end, yes, I guess if I really want to answer your question, I just feel like, okay, I'm different. But what's changed is I don't care if you in your head think of me in one way or the other, because I don't think it matters. And I'm so comfortable in my space on that. We can talk about that's sort of where I'm at. But I would say, as a parent, it's really important for parents to understand and appreciate that their children deserve the autonomy in that like labeling space to decide where they want to evolve in that. How do they want to assign that to the, what label? And by the way, keep on listening, like I said, because that might change. They might change their opinion on this, and that's okay too.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you. As I mentioned, my son has cerebral palsy, and of course, that's a very physical disability or difference. And I've let him, throughout the years, he's now 20, to pick and choose. And sometimes he's very proud of it and will, make sure everyone knows what his condition. Other times he just wants to be like everyone else. He just wants to be accepted. But I've seen him change and take kind of ownership of who he is and what is his purpose. And I think that's so exciting as a parent with any child, but especially one that might have, have overcome obstacles and things like that, to see how it is that they are accepting of what they're given.
It's interesting, Amy, because I wrote this chapter, and thank you for taking the time to read the book. It means so much. It's about building their dignity, and we can get back to the first chapter in a minute, but, that we as parents have to, sort of that is one of our most important tasks, is to help them and support them in that sense of building their dignity. But the reason I'm mentioning it is, in that same chapter, I talk about dignity tools, and one of them has to be, it happens to be a dignity ladder. And just being very mindful of the fact that both for ourselves and for our children, it's kind of like people are like, oh, did you get off on the wrong side of the bed? The answer is, and if you did, you're at the bottom of your dignity ladder. So if someone labels you a certain way, or reacts a certain way, or treats a certain way, or says something, it might really, it's like salt in a wound. And on the other hand, you could get off, and sort of the right side of the bed, and you're at the top of your dignity ladder, or your child is, and they're like, hey, you're so-and-so, fill in the blank. And you're like, all right, whatever. And so much of what, chapter 2 is focusing on giving and empowering children to be at their top of the dignity ladder. So, there's not that sort of penetration based on the external coming in.
Yeah, I love that example that you gave with that ladder. And I was thinking, I'd love to have done that when my sons were younger, and just, to have that as a visual, and to have a way to talk about it, because it's so important as parents and caregivers to look at, if you're having a bad day, or your child's having a bad day, is it because of their difference, or is it just everyone's having a bad day? And so really to see what is it that they're going through, did someone say something? Did they have a struggle they couldn't overcome or something? But just to sit back and to evaluate really what kind of day is it, and to take it from there is so important. Definitely. So I have read several times that you are often referred to as a mom on a mission. Do you agree with that description?
So yeah, that first came out in Scholastic Parent and Child years ago. And certainly I think it emerged because and we can get into later if you want to, in terms of the bullying, the take the bully by the horns chapter. But essentially, the reason I was labeled that first was because after our son Ethan, who shares my genetic condition, was bullied on the playground, I created I piloted a program called Kids Flaunt that essentially was intended to empower children who look or feel different. And then with kids, that would happily come up to me and say, I'm not different. There's nothing, and I'm like, well, you're not a robot. And so I couldn't ever decide, still to this day. And that's where my nonprofit Don't Hide It, Flaunt It was born, out of that whole program. And so for them, we do so many other things. And I know you mentioned it during the introduction, but look, at the end of the day, it's really one of those situations where I was a mom on the mission to try and make a difference in school so that those kids had a voice. I always like to say, they can become someone from something to their peers, or they go from shame to shine. And the way they do that is not only being able to express themselves through this program, but and it's like art and writing where they create something with a theme that I developed. The things that make me different make me me. But just as importantly, those kids were like, Mrs. Zucker, I'm not different. I'm not different. Well, I'm like, wait a minute. We all have our version of one finger to hide, or whatever the case may be. And so, that mom on a mission, I mean, that pilot that I did after Ethan was bullied, it became national, a national social emotional learning program for years, was in partnership with Scholastic. And we continue, actually, we have a flaunted award, as we call it, being it's at the middle school, high school level, being given to two and a scholarship to two students at Carnegie Hall on June 8th. So it's really, yeah, I guess you could say I'm a mom on a mission, because I really want to support those kids that deserve that, as well as reach the other kids and figure out ways to not, not them think that they're so different, really. They might not have the same condition, but they can feel judged. They can feel, people are making assumptions about them or their family, and we all are united in that front.
Right. I think that's such a
Kind of
good.
a long answer.
No, that's right. I love a long answer. So, I think that's a really good point, that yes, the child that has maybe something more obvious, or, diagnosed as having a disability or a difference, that's one thing, but then to also have their community, their peers and their teachers and other caregivers and their people in the library or wherever they might be, also be comfortable and be aware that just because you don't have X, Y, or Z, that there might be differences that you have. But, just sharing that information and being comfortable around others that are quote unquote different than you. I think that's so important. And I would say in the book, as I was reading it as a mom with a child that has disabilities, but I was also thinking the whole time, this is a great for any parent. Would you agree with that?
Thank you for saying that. So I'd love to talk about the audience, because just really cherish the fact that, libraries and librarians and people that are interested. In fact, the Library Journal gave it a starred review. And when they did, the verdict was, they did a nice summary. This is an essential read for all parents. And I think one of the reasons they understood that and appreciated it is that, yes, the primary audience is absolutely parents of children with differences and disabilities, or caregivers and so forth, and their families. But, there's a lot of, you saw it in the book, I do a lot of forecasting, behavioral forecasting in the book, where people can read about the way, let's say they're not a parent of a child that's different or disabled or so forth. And yet now there's two things. They can look at their own behavior or their own children's behavior in encountering another kid that they perceive as different, or whatever the case may be. And it sort of shines a light, or I should say, actually puts up a mirror in terms of that behavior and perception of it, and how it's impacting another person. And I certainly did that, even in the Helping Hands chapter, right? That I provide all this insight in terms of, that other people, anyone can understand when they're acting like Mighty Mouse to save the day. It can be with the best of intentions, but they can start to see the impact it can have, quite frankly, on the dignity of somebody if they don't have a parent that's kind of helped them get through that.
Yeah, I loved how you did those categories, your list of categories.
I
They're
figured
very
I was going to get in
numerous. And
trouble. I was like,
yeah, I like it. I really like those, and I could like
not
check off
really,
the
but
boxes of people I've met like that. So I thought those were very handy. Are any of those, do you still use those in your family? Do you kind of have like inside jokes about those kind of categories that you have throughout the book?
Yeah, I mean, so now, like, our kids, I mean, our oldest, he's living his best life in Barcelona as a junior in college. He's spring semester abroad. So,
Oh, nice.
but in terms of jokes, it's funny. Charlie, our second son, who also has extradactyly. He's a national competitor in the humorous interpretation space. He's a comedy kid, and that's what he's going
Mhm.
into college for next year. And so, there's always a lot of jokes flying, and not necessarily about people's behavior anymore. But I would tell you, to your point, it does help. The forecasting stuff, all kidding aside, is really important
Right.
because it provides that insight and strength to your children. I mean, no one likes to be blindsided. And so it really helps to offer insight to them about what's coming. When we know to anticipate something, we help ourselves. As I did in the first chapter, I'd love to talk about the embracing the new normal if you want, but our children too. I think I have that story of how Ethan was playing soccer, and and kids didn't want to touch his hand at the end. You know how kids line up to sort of pass each other no matter who wins and do a high five or touch their hands. And he's like, it's really upsetting, about that. And so maybe it wasn't a forecast. This is more like a game, but I was like, okay, Ethan, I mean, you read the book, right, Amy? So I was like,
Yes.
okay, Ethan, you're gonna, I guess there's gonna be 5 kids that won't touch your hand. He's like, Mom, I think it's gonna be 6, or whatever the case was. There's so much of that sort of insight, forecasting, games, things that we're doing at home, so that when the kids have to inevitably not always be with us, I wish we could just cuddle them forever, right? But
Right.
uh, it allows for that, for sure.
Right. And you've mentioned your opening chapter there of the new norm, the new normal. What decisions did you make to put that at right there at the beginning, just knocking it out? It was, it's there. It's the brutal truth, right? Of, as a parent, realizing that your perceived perfect child is not what we would consider perfect. Of course, we think they're perfect, but right, being able to realize that life might have put you on a different path than what you had envisioned. In my case, I had twins unexpectedly, not prepared. Had just returned back from Japan, was not in the frame of mind to, one, be pregnant, two, have twins, came 2 months early, and then one with CP and one with other issues. That was my new norm, right? That just, I had 6 weeks to process it with them being in NICU, and then my life changed drastically. But I didn't have a guidebook, and I don't even know if guidebooks would always help you in that situation. But in your case, what made you decide to start that chapter as the new normal?
And thank you for sharing. I'm like, I wish I knew you, because you could have been in the final chapters, additional words of wisdom from all these parents. And it sounds like you have your own important story to contribute. Well, a few things. Number one, and I'm so grateful that Dr. Brenda Anders Pring had, from the member of the American Academy of Pediatrics, had endorsed the book, as an important read, for parents and for doctors and so forth. And part of it is that, to your point, whether at birth or along the way, if your child is diagnosed with something later or whatever the case may be, you're in a new normal that you weren't planning for, nor were you wishing for. And it's kind of the real truth. And so embracing the new normal, to me, was important because, if we are interested enough to pick up, or if someone's interested enough to pick up my book and be like, I need to help my child, and find their dignity and let go and let live, which is the chapter about not overprotecting, keeping them safe, but all these kind of things. Um, but it was really interesting because I feel like it was important to talk about, from my own personal experience, for sure. You may have work to do. Do you care about what other people think? Because if you do, and if you're consumed by other people's judgment and and all that kind of stuff, then how can we possibly expect anything greater from our children? And they say apple doesn't fall far from the tree, and in that respect, it means so much in this context. So embracing the new normal was a few things. I did a bunch of forecasting, as like there's
Right.
going to be the I knowers, I know my husband's sister's cousin has it. And, I mean, there's all that. But I also wanted to write about that because, you were talking about that, the discussion of perfection. I call out one of my favorite movies, Moonstruck, where Cher's character says to Nicolas Cage's character, well, first she's like, snap out of it, but you can't do that so easily. So when you're embracing a new normal.
Right.
But what she does say to him is she has this conversation about perfection. And she's like, snowflakes are perfect, the stars are perfect, not us, not us. And I think that was the key. It certainly was a key for me, that, I had to let go of the notion of perfection. I had to let go that, at least in the way that we traditionally would think about it, and say, that, uh, it's almost like what I wrote about Elizabeth Brunig. I quoted her, it's not that we just have a baby, we have our baby, the sum of all babies. And that is actually to your point, that is the perfect baby. We just have to arrive there. And then ultimately start to really appreciate, how the importance of letting go of fear, how the opposite of love for me is not hate. Like the worst thing I ever did in terms of my own parenting experience was based on fears. And so embracing the new normal is like really digging into these concepts so that, as Carolyn Mace, the thought leader, said, and I quoted her, I think she was talking to Oprah Winfrey, um, you know, we just, the key is to be madly in love with the life you've been given. And we've got to do that work. And that's why I wanted to write Embracing the New Normal. I think every parent can certainly, I wish I had someone writing that. I wish, to your point, a lot of people don't know what to say when, child is born with something, or what do I say? And to me, I think, to your point about who's the audience, it provides, hopefully insight and thinking about, well, if someone doesn't know what to say, what do I say?
Mhm.
And also maybe what, here's what you say, and here's how you handle it if you're just on the outside of someone's family experience.
Right. Definitely having that sense of empathy, or just knowing that probably they're just like you in some ways, right? And to teach your child with and without the differences that, children just want to be kids. They just want to play and have friends just like everyone else. So I think that's really important. One point that you mentioned, I think rang a bell with me when I was reading it, is your chapter about let go and let it live. And then you also have your advice is that just let your children fail. Those two, to me, out of your entire book, really were important, because I think that's the part that I picked for my family, that's how we would do with it. We couldn't change the fact that Benjamin has cerebral palsy. That's just the way it was. And Matthew, his twin brother, has his other, he had speech impediments and some other issues. But that is hard as a parent, right? I can say,
Gosh.
like, whatever, everything's great. My days are perfect. And I try to do that, but I also know health, like, you have to be healthy and have that balance. And that's hard as any parent. And then to let your children fail. And I often tell people who have younger children that that is very hard as a parent, but that is so important. And I really appreciate that you added that into your book to show people in parenting that, you just have to go with the punches of how your life is. And it is easier said than done. But as your child gets older, I think you start to reap those rewards of that hard work. And like you said with your son, he's living his best life in Barcelona. I mean, who wouldn't? What kind of parent would not be proud of their son for doing something like that, and maybe a little bit jealous, right? That they've achieved these wonderful things. So when you were writing the book and putting this all into perspective, what bit of advice in the entire book, if you had to pick only one,
Oh,
what would you
gee.
share with parents today?
Um,
You have so many good ones, but if you can only pick one.
oh my gosh, that's so hard. And I'll just say that, I think I touched upon it, which was don't don't be governed by your fear.
Mhm.
Like, make certain, because it ties into the sort of letting, if we're gonna not let our children try things, so to make certain and protect them so they don't fail, so they don't feel badly, or they're not perceived as whatever the case may be, that's out of fear. Um, if we're going, a lot of times I know that parents, even safety aside, will really worry about sort of, okay, why don't we just make certain that we create a bubble of, and I'm going to talk about the bubble concept in a second too. But my advice would say that, if we let go of our own fears and keeping them safe, of course, but, don't overprotect. That is probably the best advice. And when we do that, when we step back, we can watch our children thrive and beyond our own wildest imaginations. I mean, I give examples of, like, I couldn't fathom that our son Charlie, he was like, I want to play baseball. I'm like, no, like, don't do that. Like, I couldn't imagine it. And instead he persisted. And, my silly fears and all that in terms of what was going to be possible, and were just completely um thankfully torn down by his own, yearnings to do things. And so, and I'll say one more thing that's really important, I think, that's tied to this, which is, when we have children that have differences or disabilities, unlike other children, where, expectations are like anything goes. And so parenting them is sort of about kind of pulling it back from that, high note to, okay, what's realistic for you, which is fine. But when you have a child with difference or disability or so forth, you kind of have to let go of your expectations. And if you let go of the fears and you allow them to navigate life in the best sort of version of their own normal, then it's all a build up, which is really cool and important and wonderful, from that advice perspective. And then the last thing I wanted to mention, that the bubble of love. I talk about, I think in the conclusion, or at some point, that, I didn't realize, I had this biggest talk about fears. I had fear about passing on my condition, to my kids. And, you know, really, just like for me too, when you do have a difference or disability, your child does, um, only the most incredibly authentic, unsuperficial, wonderful people want to know them, friend them, date them, marry them, but you fill in the blank, in that sense. That's who they attract. All the superficial jerks out there, like, don't want to bother with them. And gosh, isn't that cool and amazing? And so when you start to think about it that way, my advice for sure is just sort of, like, um, don't cling on to your fear, and know that truly, and I mean this genuinely, that what is perceived in the first chapter as something that was, a letdown of your life, it turns out to be the biggest blessing and gift. Your life experience is deeper, richer, more fulfilling. You've attracted the most wonderful, who your friends are that are like embracing you and your family now. To me, that's just everything.
Right. I would say 100 times yes on that. I believe, our family is so much richer because of their differences, and just not only our immediate family, but our extended family. They stop and think about different things, and, oh, well, what if this, or what if that, or, just, I think they have a different set of eyes because of us being aware and trying to advocate. And my role as a parent was trying to get Benjamin to be self-advocating. And I think you mentioned that quite a bit throughout the book too, just giving them um, that little push that they might need for that. And, as a mom on a mission or something like that, that you could continue to help them advocate for themselves. It's so important. for everyone. One of your chapters does talk about when there is that opposite effect of not everything going well, is when there is bullies, particularly at school. And can you touch on that for just a moment?
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned Ethan being bullied when he was in the first day of first grade by a bunch of fourth graders for being different. But there was two reasons I wanted to write that chapter. One, of course, is to help people appreciate the type of things that I did to help him get through the experience. But it was also to call out something that I think is really important, because I have seen books written, campaigns, choose kindness, kindness is a good thing for sure. But what I wanted to call out was the fact that when you're talking about a child that's different or disabled, kindness to me is insufficient. Like if someone tells their child, "Oh, be kind to Timmy," that you see in the hallway, well, you know what they're going to do? They're not going to be mean if they're listening to their parents. But kindness could even mean ignoring them, like it's just not being mean. But meanwhile, Timmy has a birthday party. He wants to, sleepovers, that he wants to invite people. And so, to me, it's not choose kindness, it's choose friendship. And the only way to me to do that is based on the type of programming I was mentioning, Don't Hide It, Flaunt It, my nonprofit does, which is really tapping into the sort of empathetic, spark that we need to really facilitate to create that. So that's why I wrote that chapter. Not only, hopefully no one experiences the pain of having your child bullied for who they are, and or what condition they have or anything like that. But I also acknowledge in the book, a lot of times people are also bullied because someone decided they were different. There wasn't anything obvious. That actually helps perspective for your child too, to be like, there's just some rotten people out there. They're going to decide people are different no matter what it is, condition or not. So
Mhm.
I wanted to give all those insights, and that's why I wrote that chapter.
Right. And I think that's so important for parents and for teachers to see how maybe the dynamics in their classroom is working. That's always a good chapter, I think, as well, for them to be aware of. So Meg, I've enjoyed talking with you, but now we get a chance to switch it over to our guests. And if they have any questions, they feel free to put it there in the chat or the Q&A box, and I'll read them out to Meg. So if you have any questions regarding the book or anything that we spoke about today, and I'll give them a moment to get them in there. But as people are putting their questions in, I've noticed that in recent years, there's been a slight increase of inclusion and celebrating differences. Do you think our society is on the right path for promoting differences in a positive light, or is there more work to be done?
I mean, look, I hesitate as an author to make big societal statements. But what I would say is I think there's always going to be work to be done in this space. And I think it's because we as a human race continue to evolve, and who we are, what we are, experiences, all the things that are happening and we're experiencing both as individuals and parents and so forth. And so, for me, I just I think that the wonderful experiences like getting, having this opportunity or having other people share, and enlightening people, figuring out ways that, people are willing to sort of listen to somebody based on their own experience and realize, it reminds me, Amy, that, I used to, for 4th of July, I used to always look into to the sky, and then look down because everyone was looking at the fireworks, and I would for a second because they're pretty, but then I was like, is anyone different like me? And then I sort of evolved, and I finally realized I had to let go of that, because it didn't matter if anyone is like me, they have my same condition. What matters is they feel like me. They understand what it feels like to be judged, or people make assumptions and things like that. And so when you're asking about society, I think that's the key. We all have our own lane. We all want to have communities of and interact with people whose children have the same condition. I mean, that's supportive and helpful and, significant. And I talk about how I screwed that up, for my kids. I think I could have benefited them more. I was like, you have me. Why do you need to know any kids with
Right.
ectrodactyly? But I think that's from a societal perspective, I think the more we can help people to unite on, again, not because we have the same thing, but we can feel the same way. I think that's how we could be most effective.
Great, thank you. So we do have one question coming in. How do you think it may be different, easier or harder for you to parent having the same condition and perhaps understanding your kids a little better, having more similar experiences versus your parents raising you?
Oh, that's a great question. Thank
That
you
is a
for
great
asking.
question.
Well, we'll start off with that. Like my parents, my arrival was a complete surprise. I mean, as I think I say in the very beginning, utter shock. I mean, they were like, what is this? And there was that label of ectrodactyly. They didn't even know what that was, and neither did the doctor. And so I think it was very different for them for that reason, because they didn't even know if I was going to be able to walk right, have any sense of a quote unquote normal life. And as a result, for them, I think, they had the strength, the incredible strength, my parents, my incredible parents, to just sort of say, well, we're not going to overprotect her. I think I wrote in the book, there was, a cousin was like, well, if I was your mom, I would never let you out of the room or out of the house. And I'm like, what? So for my parent to be very specific, I think that they let go of the reins, and really for them, it was just one of those things, which was a incredible surprise about what I would be able to do. Now, for me as a parent, I knew what I could do. So I didn't have that sort of, oh, what, are they going to lead a normal life, anything like that. I knew that was, to me, a given at this point. So I think as a parent, I needed to do two things, but it was more complicated because one of the things that I had to learn was, even if I had this and maybe I had an advantage over my own parents, I had to be reminded that my boys, my children, they don't have my same personality. And when, different personalities, I mean, Ethan was bullied, Charlie was not. Ethan as a little boy was much more shy, probably was a little bit more vulnerable to taunts than Charlie was, who's been a ham since he was like 2 when he could talk. And so, I think that the question's really important because I think that was a big learning experience for me. Yes, did I have insight that my parents didn't have? For sure. But I also had to realize that just because something worked for me and my personality didn't mean that was this perfect thing for each of them.
Mhm.
What a great question. Thank you very
That's a
much.
great question. And I was just thinking as you were saying that, do you agree, or do you think it's a good idea to have a community of parents that share the same condition as your children, or do you like to have a broader sense of community that everyone is vastly different?
Um, well, I laugh because for Don't Hide It, Flaunt It, which is sort of the umbrella nonprofit, right, for that I run, it's really the everyone type of thing. And I laughed with one of our officers when I'm like, I'd be terrible at marketing because, and clearly I never studied marketing because you're supposed to like really focus target market. This is who you start with, and then you can go broader. So I will just say, I think it is enormously important to, and in hindsight, I wish I would have realized this as I was having my babies, to connect with parents who really appreciated and understood what I was going through. I mean, I think in the book, in the first chapter, I talk about, be careful of those sort of parenting groups, mommy circles, because you can join one with other parents whose children don't share the same experience of condition and so forth. But, consider joining a circle of people that do, and maybe you're a part of both. But the most important thing is ask yourself, where do you feel super comfortable in yourself and that your children can be themselves? And, allow that to just talk about fear. Like there, you'll let go of your fears. And then once you're feeling really strong and good, I think once any of us are really feeling comfortable in our skin, that's when we get to connect with others and really unite, not despite, but because of our differences.
Right. And I couldn't agree more. So, Meg, we are almost out of time, but I want to thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule and sharing a little bit of your book. Those of you who are here in Gwinnett County, this book is available here at the library or from your local bookstore. And I highly recommend getting a copy of it. Wonderful tips, advice, humor stories, real life stories, so much that I think is so easy for the average person, even the average person, and not the extraordinary, can even relate to. So Meg, thank you so much again for joining us today. And we look forward to hearing more about your books and other endeavors that you have in the future.
Oh, I appreciate it. And if people are interested, they can go to megzucker.com, which has all the information also relating to the book. So thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
It's been a pleasure here. Thank you.